The swamp always held its secrets close, burying them under layers of moss, water, and silence. In southern Louisiana, far from the cities where jazz poured out of windows and life bustled under street lamps, there was another world. It was darker, slower, and bound by land that never fully dried. Cypress trees stood like crooked giants, their roots swallowed by the murky water. The air was thick with humidity, heavy with the smell of rot and mud. In the evenings, the sound of frogs and insects rose like a chorus, almost drowning out the uneasy quiet of human life in the bayou. It was in this setting, far removed from the gaze of outsiders, that the Broussard family lived out on the surface. They were like any other backwater family. A small house on sinking ground, patched together with wood that warped under rain, its tin roof rattling when the storms rolled in. Smoke from a crooked chimney curled into the heavy air. Their neighbors, few and far between, only saw glimpses of them. Weathered faces at the market, slow-moving figures along the muddy path that led to town. To most, they were nothing more than another poor family struggling to survive where the land itself seemed cursed. But those who lived closest to them knew something about the Broussards was different. There was always a distance in their eyes, a strange silence when outsiders tried to talk to them. They kept to themselves, children never seen at school, adults rarely mixing in church. The Broussards were a family bound so tightly to each other that it made others uneasy. They didn't need anyone else, and maybe they didn't want them. Rumors had long followed them. Whispers of odd behavior, of strange rituals, of people who got too close never returning. But in small, isolated places, people learn to mind their own business. Curiosity can get you hurt. And so, the Broussards were left alone, their secrets safe in the thick dark of the swamp. Before the crime that would stain their name forever, life had a strange normalcy for them. They rose with the sun, moving through the motions of survival. The men went into the swamp, hunting with homemade traps, returning with whatever meat they could find, fish, gators, or smaller game. The women tended to the home, their hands rough from work, their voices rarely heard outside their walls. Children grew up half-wild, barefoot in the mud, their hair long and matted, their eyes reflecting the water's dull gleam. It was a hard life, but not unusual for the bayou. Poverty shaped people differently here, yet beneath the surface, something darker stirred. Power within the family was not shared. It was held tight by a few, passed down in whispers and demands, enforced by fear. Obedience wasn't asked for. It was expected, taught early with harsh lessons. What outsiders might call love was twisted into control, a kind of loyalty that blurred the line between devotion and entrapment. The Broussards didn't question each other. They couldn't. To do so would mean risking everything. And so, whatever sickness grew inside the family, it went unchecked, passed down like blood. Those who crossed paths with them often sensed it without knowing why. A tension in the air when the Broussards entered a room, a quiet that seemed unnatural. The family rarely smiled, and when they did, it carried no warmth. There was a hunger in their gaze, something sharp that made others turn away. It was the kind of thing you couldn't quite name, but once you noticed it, you never forgot it. The town around them wasn't blind to their strangeness. People whispered about inbreeding, about old Cajun curses, about generations living too close and too isolated. Mothers warned their children to stay away from the Broussard place, telling them it wasn't safe. Some stories were ridiculous, born from superstition and fear of what was different. But others carried a weight, told in hushed voices late at night, with eyes darting toward the swamp as if something might be listening. For years, nothing ever surfaced. The Broussards kept their lives hidden, their world closed off. Outsiders came and went, some to buy fish or meat, some just passing through, but none stayed long enough to peel back the layers. That silence, that separation, was their protection. But silence has its limits. Secrets rot when they're buried too long, and the Broussards have been burying theirs for generations. The land itself seemed to reflect the weight of what was coming. Nights felt longer. Shadows clung heavier to the swamp. People in town, said they heard strange cries out in the dark, too high-pitched to be animals, too wild to be human. Dogs howled for hours, refusing to go near the edges of the water. Hunters came back with stories of finding bones in places no one should have been. And slowly, people began to speak louder about the Broussards. Not just whispers this time. Questions, suspicions, the kind of talk that built momentum. The Broussard family went about their lives as if nothing had changed. But inside their walls, there was no denying that things were shifting. Tensions grew between them, and suspicions turned inward. Power was being tested, and in the stillness of the swamp, something in their blood, something that had always been waiting, was about to surface. The fragile mask of normal life was beginning to crack. The swamp was always quiet, but inside the Broussard home, the silence was heavier than ever. It wasn't the kind of quiet that brought peace. It was the kind that pressed down on the chest, the kind that made people whisper when they should have spoken out loud. Tensions had been building for years, but now they were rising in ways no one could ignore. What had once been hidden in the folds of daily life began to slip through, showing itself in arguments, glances, and bursts of anger too sharp to dismiss. The Broussard family lived stacked on top of one another. Too many bodies in a house too small, too many secrets pressing against thin walls. When the rains came, they were forced closer, unable to escape the smell of damp wood and unwashed clothes. That closeness festered like a wound. The father, a man whose word was law in the house, ruled with a hand that grew heavier the older he got. His eyes seemed to watch everything, and his voice was quick to rise if anyone stepped out of line. His children obeyed because they knew what defiance cost. But cracks were forming. The oldest son was restless. He had begun to look at his father not as a leader, but as a man who had held him down too long. He wanted more freedom, more power, maybe even to take the family into his own hands. That hunger made him reckless. He challenged his father with small acts at first, arguing about how the trap should be set, questioning decisions about food or hunting. But his defiance grew sharper, bolder. The father answered with rage, striking him in front of the others, a reminder of who held control. Yet the son's eyes, dark and burning, never lowered. This battle of wills unsettled the family. The younger children watched in silence, fear mixing with a strange excitement. The mother, weary and hardened by years of submission, kept her head down, but she felt the shift too. Her survival had always depended on obedience, but she could feel the family pulling apart, the order breaking down. She worried about what that meant, for her children, for all of them. She had seen what happened when men in the swamp let anger rule. Blood was always the outcome. The family's financial struggles added another layer to the tension. Hunting and trapping were no longer enough. The swamp wasn't as giving as it once was. The game grew scarce. The water was poisoned by runoff, and outsiders bought less of what the Broussards brought to town. The few times they appeared at the market, they were met with more suspicion than trade. People didn't trust their goods, whispering about sickness, about meat that didn't look right. Every rejection deepened the family's isolation. Hunger crept in, gnawing at stomachs and at pride. The father's pride, especially, suffered under the weight of poverty. Once, he had commanded fear and respect. Now, he was mocked behind his back, seen as a man unable to provide for his family. That shame twisted into fury. At home, he lashed out more often, not only at his son, but at anyone within reach. Every failure outside the house became an explosion inside it. His grip on control tightened, and with it, the family's resentment grew. The oldest son wasn't the only one testing limits. A daughter, quiet for most of her life, began to pull away from the rules her father enforced. She wanted to break free of the family shadow, to see life beyond the swamp. She spoke of leaving, of finding work in town, of a future that didn't involve the endless cycle of mud and hunger. Her father crushed those words whenever he heard them, but once spoken, they couldn't be unspoken. The idea lingered, and the others began to wonder, too, what life outside might be like. That wondering was dangerous. The Broussards didn't tolerate thoughts of escape. Jealousy poisoned the household further. The father's favoritism was clear. One child received softer words, an extra portion of food, and a rare smile, while the others were left in the shadows. That favoritism bred bitterness, quiet resentment that festered in the dark. Siblings who once relied on each other began to turn inward, mistrusting even the ones who shared their suffering. A family once bound by blood now tore at itself with sharp edges of envy and suspicion. Past grievances also began to surface. Old wrongs that had been buried under fear came bubbling up. The mother remembered betrayals from her husband that she had never dared speak of. The son remembered beatings that had left him broken, and he carried that pain like a blade. The daughter, too, bore scars, both seen and unseen, from years of being silenced. These memories didn't fade. They grew heavier with time, pressing against each person until it became clear that no one had truly forgotten. The outside world added fuel to the fire. Townspeople grew bolder in their talk, spreading rumors of what went on inside the Broussard home. Some claimed they had seen things, strange lights at night, bones scattered in the water, figures moving in the dark. Others said they had heard screams drifting across the swamp. Whether true or not, the story stuck. The family heard them too, and the weight of those suspicions made them paranoid. They began to see enemies everywhere, convinced that outsiders wanted to expose them, to destroy them. That paranoia fed the father's control and the son's defiance, locking them in a battle neither could walk away from. Inside the family, the air thickened with unspoken words. Small moments carried heavy meaning. A slammed door became a declaration of war. A lingering stare across the table burned like fire. Even meals, once silent and routine, became tense gatherings where every scrape of a spoon, every breath, felt like a test. The children whispered among themselves, wondering when the next blow would fall, who it would fall on. Fear lived with them, slept beside them, woke them in the night. But fear was not the only force at play. Desire, obsession, and control wove themselves through the family's relationships. Lines between love and ownership blurred, turning bonds into chains. Affection became twisted, a weapon used to demand obedience. The oldest son, desperate to escape his father's shadow, also feared losing his place within the family. His identity was bound to the Broussard name, even as he longed to destroy the man who led it. The daughter, torn between loyalty and the dream of freedom, felt herself pulled in two directions, neither of which promised safety. The mother, trapped between protecting her children and obeying her husband, grew desperate, her silence breaking into small, bitter outbursts that shocked even herself. Every day seemed to bring the family closer to a breaking point. Fights erupted with little cause. The father accused his son of plotting against him. The son accused his father of leading them into ruin. The daughter begged for change, only to be silenced with threats. The mother prayed in whispers that no one ever heard. And through it all, the swamp watched, holding its secrets as it always had. But even the swamp seemed restless. The Broussards were collapsing inward, crushed by poverty, shame, and their own twisted bonds. Each member carried their own darkness, and that darkness was beginning to show. The fragile order that had held them together was unraveling thread by thread. They were no longer just a family fighting hunger and hardship. They were a family at war with itself, each person pulled by forces too strong to resist. And in that war, something terrible was waiting to happen. The night it happened was heavy with heat. The swamp air clung to the skin, thick and unmoving, as if even nature was holding its breath. Inside the Broussard home, tempers had boiled all day. A storm had passed hours earlier, leaving the house damp, the walls sweating with moisture. The smell of wet earth drifted through the broken boards, mixing with the scent of smoke and sweat. Everyone was on edge. The father had returned from town empty-handed again, mocked and dismissed by men who wouldn't trade with him. He came home angrier than ever, his shame wrapped in violence, his voice booming through the cramped space. The family gathered at the table, though there was little food to share. bowls of thin stew, scraps of meat no one wanted to name. The silence was sharp, broken only by the sound of spoons scraping wood. The father's glare moved across the room, daring anyone to speak. It landed on his oldest son, who sat stiff, jaw tight, his eyes refusing to drop. That defiance, silent and steady, was enough to set the night ablaze. Words came first, harsh and spitting, the father accusing his son of weakness, of betrayal, of plotting to undermine him. The son, pushed too far, answered back with a voice full of rage he had held in for years. He shouted that his father was a failure, that the family was starving under his rule, that he no longer deserved to lead. The words echoed in the small room like blows. The father rose, his chair crashing to the floor, his fist striking the table so hard the bowls rattled. The others froze, children wide-eyed, the mother clutching her hands to her chest. But the son did not back down. He stood, his body trembling not with fear but with fury, and for the first time, he struck back when his father raised a hand to him. That single act of defiance shattered the fragile balance that had kept the Broussards from tearing each other apart. The fight was brutal, animalistic. Flesh against flesh, bone against bone, the sounds of fists cracking against skin and wood. The father's strength was still greater, but the son's desperation gave him a wild edge. They crashed into walls, knocking loose boards and filling the air with splinters. The younger children screamed, some crying, others frozen, unable to look away. The mother shouted, begging them to stop, her voice breaking, but neither man heard. Years of pain, humiliation, and hunger poured out in every strike. The climax came suddenly. The father grabbed a knife from the table, its blade dulled but still deadly. His eyes burned with madness, with the certainty that he must destroy his son to keep control. For a heartbeat, the room froze, the family seeing the knife gleam in the dim light. The son, cornered, wrestled with him, their hands locked around the weapon. The struggle was frantic, both grunting, breath ragged, bodies slipping with sweat. Then, in a moment that seemed to stretch forever, the blade sank into flesh. The son gasped, then pushed harder, twisting the knife away. Blood spilled across his hands, hot and slick, and when the father collapsed, the room erupted in screams. The sound was raw, piercing, echoing against the swamp outside. The father lay on the floor, his breath choking, his eyes wide with shock. His mouth opened, as if to curse, as if to command one last time, but no words came. His chest heaved once, twice, then stilled. The son dropped the knife, staring at his blood-covered hands. His rage drained into horror, the reality of what he had done crashing over him. He had wanted freedom, power, respect, but not like this. Not with his father's body cooling on the floor, his siblings watching him with fear instead of admiration. He stumbled back, his mind spiraling between triumph and terror. The mother fell to her knees beside her husband, pressing her hands to the wound as if she could hold him together. But she knew. The look in her eyes was not just grief, it was fear. She had lived her life under his control, but now, without him, the family was adrift. She looked at her son, her face torn between hate and dependence. He had killed the man who had ruled them, but he had also broken the only order they had ever known. Panic swept through the room. The younger children cried and clung to one another, their voices high and sharp. Some begged for our father to wake. Others looked to their brother with terror. The daughter, who had long dreamed of leaving, stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the blood pooling across the floor. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She only stared, her thoughts hidden but heavy, as if she was already calculating what this meant for her future. The son tried to speak, his voice shaking. He said it had been self-defense, that his father had brought the knife, that he hadn't meant to kill him. But no one moved, no one answered. The silence was worse than screams. It was a silence that said everything had changed. Then came the questions of what to do. The mother, still shaking, whispered that no one could know. If the town heard of this, they would all be ruined. The rumors were already against them. A crime like this would not only destroy the son, but also the whole family. They would be hunted, driven out, or worse. Her words fell like a curse, binding them to a secret they could never undo. The son nodded, numb, though part of him wanted to run, to leave the swamp and never look back. But the swamp was in his blood, the family's chains too tight. Instead, he followed his mother's command. Together, they dragged the body into the night, the weight heavy, the swamp waiting like a grave. The sound of frogs and insects returned, indifferent, as they carried him to the water's edge. The mud sucked at their feet, and when they lowered him into the black, still water, the swamp swallowed him without a sound. When they returned to the house, the air felt different. The father's presence was gone, but his shadow lingered. The family sat in silence, the children's sobs fading into hiccups, the daughter still staring, the son trembling, the mother's face hardened with resolve. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. In the days that followed, they would struggle with the weight of what they had done. Some would convince themselves it was justice, that the father had earned his end. Others would live with nightmares, hearing his last breath in the dark. But in that moment, in the heat of the swamp night, the Broussard family became bound by something stronger than blood, the shared guilt of murder and the knowledge that secrets, once born, demanded to be kept. The swamp did not change. The frogs still croaked through the night, the insects still hummed, and the cypress trees still stood with their roots deep in black water. But inside the Broussard home, nothing was the same. The air felt heavier, as if every breath carried the weight of what they had done. The father was gone, hidden beneath the swamp, but his presence lingered in the silence, in the fearful glances, in the way no one spoke his name out loud. The son, who had driven the knife, carried the weight most of all. In the first days after the killing, he moved through the house like a shadow, avoiding his family's eyes, washing his hands until his skin cracked. He told himself it had been survival, that his father had left him no choice. But the memory of the blade slipping, the sound of his father's breath choking away, clung to him no matter how hard he tried to bury it. At night, he woke in a sweat, convinced he heard footsteps outside, or his father's voice calling his name. The mother hardened quickly. She had seen death before. Animals, neighbors, even her own kin lost to sickness and hunger. But this was different. This was murder in her own home, and it had been done by her own blood. She told herself it had been necessary, that the son had saved them all from a tyrant. But deep down, she feared what that meant. If killing had freed them once, would it be called upon again? She lived with her grief in silence. Her prayers bitter, her face a mask of strength, even as her hands trembled when no one was watching. The daughter reacted differently. She didn't weep, not even when the others did. She became colder, distant, her eyes sharper, her voice clipped. In her, something had shifted. Hope had curdled into calculation. She saw the family now as fractured, vulnerable, and she understood what her father's death truly meant. The rules that had bound them were gone, and with them, the fragile structure of their lives. Freedom seemed closer, but so did danger. She carried herself as if she were already halfway gone, though the swamp still held her. The younger children were not given words for what had happened. The mother hushed them, told them to forget, told them it was over. But children do not forget. Their nights were filled with nightmares, their days with unease. Some whispered among themselves, asking if their father would come back, if he would rise from the swamp to punish them. Others looked at their brother with fear, unable to see him as the same boy who once led them barefoot through the mud. Their innocence had been cracked open, and though they could not name it, they felt the weight of blood in the air. The community noticed the change, too. The Broussards had always been strange, but now they were stranger still. The father, once seen on rare visits to town, no longer appeared. Whispers began. Had he abandoned his family? Had he fallen sick? Or worse, had the swamp claimed him? The family's silence fed the rumors. When the son came to town in his place, people noticed the tension in his jaw, the way he avoided questions. The daughter's sharp stares unsettled those who crossed her path. And the mother, thinner and paler, spoke only when she had to, her voice carrying a weight people couldn't name. The rumors spread wider. Some said the Broussards had finally turned on themselves, that all the years of isolation and secrecy had ended in blood. Others claimed they were cursed, that the swamp had demanded a sacrifice and taken a father. Old stories of inbreeding and strange appetites resurfaced, growing darker with each retelling. Children in town dared each other to wander near the Broussard place, though none stayed long. The family's name became a shadow, whispered more often than spoken. Inside the house, guilt twisted into different forms. The son grew defensive, snapping at anyone who hinted at disobedience. He had wanted freedom from his father, but now he was bound by the crime. To lose control would mean the truth spilling out. He began to mirror some of the very behaviors he had hated in his father, ordering his siblings, raising his hand in anger, using fear to hold them together. The others saw it, even if they didn't speak of it. The cycle had not been broken. It had only shifted. The mother battled with her own conscience. She told herself she had protected her children, that she had kept them safe from ruin. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw her husband's face in those last moments, not angry but shocked, betrayed. She wondered if she had failed him, if her silence and compliance had led them all here. Her grief was tangled with relief, her love with hate. She prayed harder than ever, but her prayers brought no peace, only echoes in her mind of sins too heavy to be forgiven. The daughter, watching it all, grew sharper still. She saw her brother becoming the very thing he had fought against, and it hardened her resolve. If she had once dreamed of escape, now she dreamed of survival, no matter what it cost. Her eyes followed every move, her mind recording every weakness, every fracture. She knew that when the time came, she would not hesitate. The younger children carried the weight in silence, their childhood stolen. Some grew more withdrawn, hiding in corners, avoiding conflict. Others lashed out in sudden bursts, mimicking the violence they had seen. The house became a place of ghosts, every corner heavy with memory, every shadow holding fear. The swamp kept its secret, but secrets have a way of seeping through cracks. Strangers began asking questions when they passed through town, curious about the family whose patriarch had vanished. Hunters said they found bones in the water, half hidden in mud, though none dared to say whose they might be. The townspeople grew restless, watching the Broussards with sharper eyes, waiting for the truth to slip. The family tried to live as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Their meals were quieter, their trips to town shorter, their glances at one another sharper. Every sound outside the house made them tense. Every knock on the door felt like a threat. They lived in fear not only of being discovered, but of themselves. The crime had bound them together with chains heavier than any their father had forged. The father was gone, but in many ways he was still there. He lived in their guilt, in their nightmares, in the way his shadow stretched long over the swamp. He had ruled them in life, and now he ruled them in death. And though the swamp swallowed his body, it could not bury the truth forever. The Broussards knew it. The town suspected it. And in the silence of their home, each of them carried the same thought, though none spoke it out loud. Sooner or later, the swamp gives everything back. The story of the Broussard family never left the swamp. Not entirely. The land that had hidden them for so long eventually betrayed them, as secrets always do. Years after the night of blood, bones surfaced where they should not have been, half buried in mud, tangled in roots, gnawed clean by creatures that did not care about the sins of men. Hunters whispered of what they found, and soon the whispers grew too loud to ignore. The law, slow to move in the backwaters, was finally drawn into the mire. When the authorities arrived, the Broussards did not resist. They had already been living under a kind of captivity, trapped not by walls, but by guilt. The son, older now, carried himself with the weight of a man who had long awaited judgment. He said little when questioned, his silence speaking louder than words. The mother wept, but not in surprise, as though she had known all along this moment would come. The daughter remained stone-faced, her eyes hard, her lips pressed tight. The why? Our children clung to each other, their innocence long since fractured. The trial that followed was unlike anything the town had seen. The Broussards had always been spoken of in hushed tones, but now their lives were dragged into the light. Neighbors testified to the strangeness of the family, to the rumors that had circled for decades. Some admitted they had suspected violence all along, but had chosen not to act. Others expressed shock, feigning ignorance, unwilling to admit how much they had looked away. The courtroom smelled of sweat and fear, heavy with the weight of truth that had been too long buried. The son was found guilty of patricide. Some argued it had been self-defense, that he had acted only when pressed to the edge. But the brutality of the act and the family's attempt to hide it sealed his fate. He was sentenced to life, a cage replacing the swamp he had once called home. Ironically, freedom never came, not from his father, not from the law, not even from himself. The mother, though not the one who held the knife, carried her share of blame. Her silence, her part in concealing the crime, made her complicit. Yet sympathy softened her punishment. Many saw her as another victim of a cruel man and a crueler life. She lived the rest of her years marked not by chains but by shame, her name forever tied to the murder and the family's downfall. The daughter never returned to the swamp. After the trial, she left, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back. Some said she disappeared into the cities, taking a new name, carving out a life untouched by the Broussard curse. Others believed she remained haunted, unable to outrun the shadow of her father's death and her brother's fate. Wherever she went, she carried the knowledge that survival had come at the cost of blood. The younger children were scattered. Some were placed into distant families, strangers who tried to shield them from the stain of their name. But the past clung to them. Teachers spoke of their silence, of the way their eyes followed every movement in a room, watchful and guarded. They carried memories too heavy for their age, the weight of screams and blood never far from the surface. The town itself was changed. The Broussards had always been outsiders, but their crime turned them into a cautionary tale. Parents spoke their name as a warning, telling children not to wander too far, not to trust too deeply in blood. The swamp, once just a backdrop of life, became a symbol of secrets festering in the dark. Outsiders came too. Reporters, writers, curious strangers who wanted to walk the muddy paths and peer into the shadows of the old house. The Broussards became legend. Their story passed on with every retelling darker, more twisted, more removed from the truth. But the truth itself was already twisted enough. It forced questions people did not want to answer. How much had poverty shaped this tragedy? How much had isolation poisoned their lives? Was the son a murderer or a victim who finally struck back? Was the mother guilty of complicity or just another soul crushed by years of fear? And perhaps the hardest question, could it have been prevented if only someone had dared to intervene sooner? In the end, justice was served in the eyes of the law, but justice itself remained uncertain. The father was dead, but he had ruled with cruelty. The son was imprisoned, but he had acted in desperation. The family was shattered, but it had already been broken long before blood spilled on the floor. No verdict could untangle the web of power, fear, and control that had strangled the Broussards for generations. The story left behind more than just a crime. It exposed the fragility. Why of human bonds when twisted by abuse, secrecy, and shame? It revealed how power, when abused, can turn family into prison and love into chains. It showed how silence, meant to protect, can become the very thing that destroys. That in the quiet of reflection, one truth stands out. The Broussards were not born monsters. They were shaped by their world, by poverty, by isolation, by the weight of generational wounds. But choice still mattered, and in the end, choice turned them into both victims and perpetrators. The swamp still holds their memory. The house rots slowly, boards collapsing, vines swallowing what remains. Hunters still whisper of cries in the night, of shadows moving where no one should be. Perhaps it is only the wind. Or perhaps it is the echo of a family bound forever by their secrets. A reminder that some sins do not stay buried. And so the legend of the Broussards lingers, part crime, part myth, part warning. A story of power and blood, of guilt and silence, of how even the deepest swamp cannot drown the truth. In the end, it returns, as it always does, asking us to face not only what they did, but what we allow to happen when we look away.